Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think my task has been made easier by the excellent set of presentations that we've seen and the, I think, extremely passionate yet very well reasoned address, Sandeep, and the report that I hope all of you get a chance to read. If I may, I am going to get straight to it, but I'll only mention one thing to our fellow panelists and to you. I think in the spirit of what Sandeep has also laid out and Dr. Saraswat did, Ambassador Saran did, it's of course a very important topic that we're discussing, this intersection of AI with science, sovereignty, and security. And I think for too many months and maybe years, we have patted ourselves on the back for things that we have done. But I think it's always important to always be focused on the things that maybe we are not focused on or not getting done. And so my goal here, sitting with the esteemed panelists that I have to my right, is going to be to shake things up, not accept things that seem to be high level. So I encourage all of our panelists today as we move through this panel to be specific, hopefully with very specific recommendations for many of the decision makers that are also sitting in this room. So with that brief introduction, the first piece that we're going to try and answer, the first question that we're going to try and address is where are we as India on the foundational pieces that we need to get our AI strategy right and get our AI adoption and implementation right? Where are we on those foundational pieces? Compute, infrastructure, data, talent, R&D, capital, etc. We're then going to move into the second piece, which is the intersection of AI with national security, where I'm going to call upon Air Marshal Dharkar to lead that part of the discussion, where how is AI being adopted in the national security establishment of India, both within the armed forces and elsewhere, and where are there gaps, what are the structural challenges that we face and how to overcome them. And the third piece is going to be a little bit more recommendation focused, which will be where are those cross-institutional collaborations needed within India so that India can evolve its own military, government, academia, industry, and startup complex that together, as Sandeep you mentioned, as a team effort, and as we've seen in the US and China, various models have evolved for this public-private collaboration along with academia and research. And so what does that model for India look like? Where are the challenges specifically coming? And how can we overcome? So those are the three broad sections we'll try and have over the course of the next 40 minutes. With that, let me first invite Manan. And I'm not starting with him because he's a fellow Suri. But really because Manan brings two key perspectives. The perspective, of course, research and academia, sitting in IIT Delhi and doing excellent research, as Sandeep mentioned, but also from a startup standpoint, having been part of the IDEX program, also from the Ministry of Defense perspective. Manan, if I may have you start us off with where the first question that I laid out, which is where are we on those foundational capabilities? Where are the gaps from the at least two hats that you wear?
Sure. Thank you, Anirudh. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for having me to share, some thoughts and opinions. The whole question about AI, right? If we look at the nuts and bolts or the ingredients behind it, we have about 4 or 5 different pillars, which, when they come together, lead us to the AI or the so-called AI paradigm. The first thing is obviously data, the algorithms, compute or infra, which enables the churning of this data through the algorithms. Then there is skill, adequate skill, appropriate skill to drive these systems, build these systems, and then finally, policy. So I think we really need to ask ourselves that as a nation, what sort of leverage we have or what sort of leverage we are building in a global context for each of these pillars, right? And it's a bit concerning to say that to see and say that there are two of the pillars, one data and the other is skill. That is where we have the numbers. That is something which we are able to generate. But then are we able to convert it to a leverage? That is what we need to address, right? And as far as the in my opinion, my personal opinion, the most important thing for all of this AI and even the future of AI, or however you call it, will be the compute infra, the silicon, the bare metal, or the chips or the circuits which power all of this. The algorithms will be in a flux. The algorithms is the mathematics, the statistics that has been there around for several decades. In fact, what has actually enabled or empowered those algorithms is the access to the compute, powerful compute. So I think that is the most important aspect in my opinion.
So, if I may, before I move to Dr. Bansal, Manan, you mentioned that we have the data and we have the talent and the skill. If I may push back on that, if you look at our data as India today, whether it's data from a commercial standpoint or from a security standpoint, etc., or data that you need for research, specifically in the sectors that the Indian government has said are priority sectors in a way, healthcare, education, agri, isn't too much of the data still locked in silos and not accessible to researchers or startups? Question one. Second, on the talent piece, if I may push back on that also, one of the pieces I wrote recently on the missing pieces in India's AI puzzle, I said that actually while we pat ourselves on the back for being a talent nation, and you are very much a part of that for India, do we have the right kind of AI talent sitting here as well? Because the software engineers that we are very proud of, that are in thousands and hundreds of thousands sitting in Bangalore, that's not necessarily the talent that we are looking for cutting edge AI innovation, let's say. So, on those 2 points, if you may share your thoughts on the data and the talent, are we actually that well off?
So I have a slightly different, thought. I think it's very tactical to just think that whether the data is being available to the researchers or to industry, or whether we have the right kind of talent. A more strategic way of thinking it from national capacity would be, we are heading towards an age where AI will govern the geopolitics, right? So as a national capacity, are we, protecting our data? Or are we playing out the right way to have that data as a leverage from a national context? That is what we must be looking at. So models are built on data, and if those models are going to come back to India being offered not as a priority one, or if they are going to be used as a leverage in a national context, then that is, I would say, that is a more in my opinion, that is from a long term perspective, that is the lens at which we should look at data with. Obviously, internal sharing is opening up. The government's geospatial data sharing policy is one example in that direction, where for internal consumption data sharing is opening up. The same goes for talent. Talent number is there. Answering that whether it is the right talent is maybe a subset. The bigger question is the talent number that we have in this age where AI will be used as a geopolitical tool. Are we leveraging it? Is the country monetizing it? Is the IPR for the country getting monetized in the right way from a national capacity building standpoint? So that is what.
Excellent. And one last question to you before I move to Dr. Bansal. I think Sandeep raised this question, and I thought it's a very relevant one, so I want to ask you. The whole world seems to be, at least in the mainstream media, focused on LLMs. We have talked as a country about our sovereign LLMs. We have identified companies to build sovereign LLMs. AI, of course, is a much broader set of technologies. So, in our research, in our focus, in our resource allocation as a country, do you think we are focused on the right set of things within the broader field of AI? Or are there 3 or 4 other maybe pieces of that AI technology scope that you think we could focus on?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the dominant focus is more on exploitation or the last layer or utilization layer. That is using LLMs or what you do with LLMs. So that is where the more dominant focus is on. But I think in the long run, the AI race is a resource intensive race. So because AI runs on enormous amounts of energy. So from a long term planning point of view, the key differentiator will be energy efficient AI. So things like edge compute or low power compute, or chips or architectures, things like optical computing, photonic computing, neuromorphic computing, anything that cuts down the energy budget of generating AI, training AI, inferencing AI. So that is where the core focus should be in the long run.
No, excellent. I think that's an excellent point. In a recent conversation I was having with Professor Stuart Russell, who's at the University of California, Berkeley, we were discussing exactly this question. Is there an end to the amount of energy guzzling infrastructure that we are building and the compute and the processing that we're building today in that global race for LLM and AI domination? Or is it actually a more energy efficient focus, a better strategic focus? So great. Dr. Bansal, let me now bring you in. You, of course, are with the Office of the PSA. At the core of, I think, India's R&D and science efforts to, I think, reimagine our scientific research institutions, collaboration between industry and academia. I'll start off with the same basic question for you. Where are we on those foundational pieces that we need for AI? But within that, I also want you to address something that I noted in the report also that has been released today, that India's AI strategy seems to be state-driven. Do you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, do you think that's the right way to do it? Because if you look at the US and China, the two current leaders in AI, by most measures, they seem to have a very private and public aligned approach. So maybe you can address that piece also.
Thank you, Anirudh. A very good evening to all of you, and I'm really thankful for this opportunity. There has been a comprehensive discussion started with Dr. Saraswat, and then Vaslikar Sahab has spoken about the importance and strategic importance of AI. So I would like to start with a positive note here. So AI is for all. This is what our strategy says. And the Stanford 2025 list says about the vibrancy within India, we are at third rank after US and China. It's a very good sign. And, there is a process cycle for everything. So deployment at the population's scale itself is not a bad idea to begin with. And on the side of it, the government or the ecosystem development, you told the state-run strategy, or, if you see the China, with all regards to their policy, it's also state-driven. The private comes as a partner for the commercialization and other stuff. India is following the similar kind of thing, and considering the kind of resource-intensive requirement is there. Manan has mentioned about compute. It's important that government comes into play and create kind of resource pool so that access or the barrier to research for our researchers and startups reduces. And therefore, it's important to create resource like 38,000 GPU. And having said that, when India AI mission was envisaged, initially we were discussing about 10,000 GPUs.
Correct.
And within very small time, it has reached to 38,000. And if the government is expanding at this stage, then the number will not limit at this. Because, the indigenous foundation model development, the Sarvam and all those, to name a few, their requirement is so intensive. So government certainly is going to expand the resource pool. And therefore, if you see the life cycle of any technology development, particularly like AI, with a strategic dual use, a government has to come and play. And that is what government is following. Having said that, industry is partnering in the India AI mission. There are 7 pillars. And the pillars related to tech development and the research is very much being anchored in academic institution as well as industry.
Right. I've noted, I think, a bunch of very, excellent moves within the AI mission. One being to set up those centers of excellence at various IITs, I believe. And of course, I think the research institutions play a big role in this. And I would also say that you're right, that the Chinese model, of course, is state-driven. One can argue even in the US, the last several years, they've been thinking from a government standpoint very actively about where the AI race is going, where they are competing with the Chinese. But let me push back a little bit again. Are we in a position as the Indian government, despite now being the third or fourth largest economy, to dedicate the kind of resources and capital that's needed to win or compete? Because our India AI mission, I believe, is at about $1 billion plus allocation from the budget. The RDI fund that was mentioned is 100,000 crores, but spread over 5 years. So that's 20,000 crores a year. But if you look at some of the numbers cited here in this report, you see that both on the GPU side, in terms of the resource allocation that's being done by, let's say, the Chinese government, if you were to take that as an example, of course, they're 5 times bigger than us as an economy. Are we in a position to allocate enough? Or do you think the bulk of the funding here actually should be coming from the private sector, with maybe the initial seed being done by the Indian government?
I think the answer is both. The government is ramping up the investment, and which is very much needed. But private sector should also come up and invest in
so
the
could you give us a sense of
core
what kind of
research.
ratio we should be looking at? Just to be more specific, like if you were to think of the larger resource allocation towards AI in India, is it that the government should be 80% to privates 20%, 50-50, or some kind of ratio?
Okay, so the government has not yet come out with some figure, but if we want to draw a parallel, say for example, I think Vaslikar Saab spoke about ANRF and RDI, 2 schemes. So 1 lakh crore
Correct.
for the RDI and 50,000 for ANRF. Now for the RDI is purely for private. It's long-term loans and grants, very, very bold move by the government.
Yes.
And even the funds will be managed by not by the government or IITs and all. So it's very different in its design itself. Now for the ANRF, the government has thought through that 14,000 crore across 5 years' time will come from government, and the rest is anticipated to come for the private. So it is 14 versus 36,000 crore as envisaged in ARF, and now it's private sector to come up and respond to this call for government. That is the one thing. And the second thing about the matching the investment with respect to China or the US. I think at this stage, it's not good to compare the scale or whatever, considering our GDP size, and that at the time of entry we are entering into this, but rather we should look into the gradient of expansion or the curve at the speed with which we are expanding, and that is very important. And the second piece is that China has shown about through the DeepSeek that it's not about the compute intensive resources, but it's also about energy efficient algorithms, and also joining the hands to, instead of entering into large long LLM race, enter into SLM and the agentic AI system, and which government is certainly moving towards that.
Great. And the last question before I move to Marshal Dharkar, to you, Dr. Bansal, would be, if you were to look at the 6 or 7 pillars of the India AI mission, and Manan also mentioned the pieces required here, where do you think India stands strongest? And where are maybe the weaker points amongst those 6 or 7 pillars? So between data, R&D...
okay, again, difficult
compute.
to compare apple and orange, but the strong field is future skill prime, which is capacity building.
The skilling
capacity
piece of it.
building, the skilling part, that is a strong piece. And so is the case for the compute shared infrastructure, because, we have a history of having DPI. So certainly scaling that, like DPI for AI or AI to DPI, those kind of things, we know how to scale. So we have positive point there. Now the third piece, which nobody has spoken about, that is the regulation. US has something, no regulation approach. And there is EU, the GDPR Act, EU AI Act, which is supposedly slowing down their growth. I don't know. People do say. I do not have sufficient data to claim this. Now, what is the third approach or the middle path? I think you spoke about the middle path, I have noted. So, the middle path is our techno-legal regulation, which encourage people with hands off without reduce the compliance burden for the small startups. If the deployment is not at that scale and the risk is not, perceived risk is not that big, then we can go with a combination. And the techno-legal approach is something which India wants to push as a unique approach. And we are extensively working on that. And therefore, safe and trusted pillar of AI, the seventh pillar, we are going to attain leadership.
Great. With that, let me now move to you, sir, Marshal Dharkar. Today, of course, we are in a discussion where we're not looking only at the commercial aspects of AI. I think, as has been rightly pointed out, there are serious implications for India's national security that arise out of the AI evolution, both within India, but in any case, when you're fighting a battle, you have to be focused not just on your AI capabilities, but also, even more importantly, maybe the AI capabilities of the adversary. So if I may invite you to share some thoughts on where India stands on AI X national security, where are we getting things right, where are there still gaps, and what can be maybe learned from other countries.
Thank you, Anirudh. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege to be here. And I'll jump right into what Anirudh just mentioned. Where are we? Where are there gaps? Where do we find ourselves doing well? Let me just start with the basics, saying that where we seem to be doing well is that there is adequate, abundant recognition that we need to work in this domain. That itself, in my opinion, is a good starting block to work from. Where are the gaps? The fact that we lag reasonably behind, forget the world leaders, we lag reasonably behind a number of entities out there in the world, including our adversaries, is where we need to hasten what we are doing. And taking away from both what Manan and Preeti have mentioned, there is adequate work that has been initiated. What has changed, or what requires to change actually, is that the acceleration in this across domains needs to be both assisted, enabled, legislated, and alongside it, somewhat regulated. To find a fine balance, to strike an adequate balance amongst all these is where the challenge will lie. But alongside that, the other challenges that also remain would be that currently we do not definitely have a skill set in the middle level hierarchy who will actually work on this adequately, which means that the processes that we will incorporate need to change from what we've been doing so far, whether it is in the manner in which we construct new mechanisms to harness, to build and harness AI, whether it is the manner in which we use cross-domain transfer of data, whether within only the military domain or alongside that in the entire national security matrix, whether we allow this in an entirely government-run or a government-aided and a public-private partnership kind of an approach, the amount of resource that we allocate to this, both in terms of finance, infrastructure, and most importantly, time. Because if we stick to our existing mechanisms and methodologies of whether it is procurement or of upskilling or of harnessing human resource, then I guess the time that we will take in actually getting to some level of capability, everything else will have moved at breakneck speed, and that gap, if in my opinion, will only build to an extent, we will not have managed to reduce it. Taking from all these, there is, in the security forces, there is abundant caution in allowing too much of private inclusion into AI structures. Largely, our interaction, in my opinion, has been with academia, and in that also with select academia, who are also otherwise enabled by the government or have some kind of their own projects or programs running in this regard. Now that one will have to firstly increase. The human resource pool that will need to come into here would not be classically uniform pool, and we will have to work with a non-uniform, largely civilian, Gen Z kind of approach in this regard, because if you were to leave it to graying or grayed out individuals, we probably will be missing that bus. I think we need to harness young talent. We seem to have been given $100,000 per person bailout by the US government in how they've gone into some recent legislation, which will, in my opinion, make a lot of talent available for the taking, provided that we look at doing it in a slightly different manner than we have done so far.
No, great. So, Marshal Dharkar, a few specific questions for you, some coming out of your remarks themselves. The public-private piece, right, which we discussed even on the foundational capabilities question. You also mentioned that while you want to, there are serious constraints. So give us some color on how the armed forces are currently thinking of balancing those, right? As you rightly said, you want to induct that talent to help you with your capability building, but at the same time, there is abundant caution being exercised. How do you do it in a way that moves quickly enough without maybe losing some of the concerns that the armed forces might legitimately have about inducting people who are not wearing uniforms?
Sandbox environments don't work very well in AI because a model that works away from the battlefield may not necessarily stand you good stead when the chips are down. However, alongside, there is adequate both recognition and the acceptance that we would have to partner with institutions, with private entities, and start with somewhat a minimalistic approach, but build it from there as the trust quotient builds. Some additional regulatory and legislative move by the government would also assist in this regard in terms of managing both the data structures, the human resource structures, and the funding in this regard. Some of it is happening. Whether it is happening at the pace at which we would like it to happen, I would reserve comment on. I would like it to be much, much faster.
The other question, I think that from my own interaction with armed forces, seems to be that a lot of the technology that you today need, because battles are coming fast and hard now. We've seen just in the last 3 years so many hot wars. We have been part of a border conflict ourselves. It seems that the technology needed to win today's wars is very quickly moving to the cutting edge and to the emerging technologies. Like this time, we saw the use of drones very actively, and of course, precision attacks are important, satellite imagery that you need, and of course, our adversaries are collaborating with each other. One of our adversaries seems to be technologically very advanced, right, and can aid other adversaries, as we saw. So in that kind of environment, we don't have the kind of time that we might need for these models of public-private collaboration to be worked out slowly and steadily, right? Unfortunately. And as a result, it seems to me that our other alternative is to purchase technology from abroad. And then that raises the questions, I think, that were set out earlier of strategic autonomy, decision-making. I think Dr. Saraswat clearly laid those out. How can the armed forces balance this need for strategic autonomy on one side, while also being at the cutting edge of tech and innovation on the other? Because when you need to win a war, if you lose because you didn't adopt the best technology, no one's going to praise you for it, right? So you have to manage somehow this balance. So how do you think, what are some specific things that maybe could work well here?
Well, you did mention the balance altogether, and yes, it will have to be done parallelly. If you look at it today, we barely have anything in the digital world that we do largely by ourselves. Most of it relies on hardware and software, or even in terms of the data management structures, lies in foreign shores, or is sourced from foreign entities. It would have to be parallel because while that is a move by the government in its own way in order to start off with silicon chip building, or thereafter, working on some kind of open source models to build from there and accelerate that process. It will have to be done parallelly because the adversary has a vote, and when you could go to real conflict is not only decided by you, which means then that if you've got to be prepared for it, you've got to use what is available to you by acquisition and work alongside to make your own as we go along. The pace of that would depend upon, or would seriously be governed by how much resource we put into it, and what kind of variations are we willing to accept as we go along. Variations in terms of how we do business, both in terms of the acquisition and the setup.
A couple other quick questions before we move on. Marshal Dharkar, if you would talk about the resource allocation, a similar question as I asked Dr. Bansal, if I was to ask you now, if today, and I don't know the exact numbers, I don't know if you do, but let's say we were allocating today a rupee towards AI adoption, integration, development in the armed forces, how much do you think it needs to be?
And this is straight off like the back of an envelope. I do not have any real knowledge on the subject, but I would believe by 2 orders of magnitude.
So 2x or 100x? 100x. So 100x. That's the kind of question I just wanted to get, because it can at least tell you where, how much you need to move.
The reason is that in the initial part, because you will have to procure a lot of this, you do not have own intrinsic capability to set out and manufacture that on my own, which means while you set that up, and it'll take a large amount of money, you also will have to spend a reasonable amount of money to set up in quick time what we need now.
Yeah.
At least for some time. And I believe half a decade, a 5-year timeline is a fair consideration to look at that. But I believe that is the kind of resource allocation you'll have to do. And though a figure of 100 lakh crore was mentioned, that exists over a reasonable timeline. I think maybe about a fourth of that in a shrunk timeline of about half a decade is what is essential. That's an entirely personal opinion. It's a back of the envelope answer.
Sure. The last question I want to pose to you is, AI is not just being used in traditional domains. AI is enabling new domains of warfare. Cyber was mentioned by Sandeep earlier. There's also, of course, the whole dimension of cognitive warfare, information warfare, the narrative wars that we saw last year as well. Is that piece going to be fought by our armed forces? Or is that going to have to be fought by non-uniform wearing institutions or individuals of India?
The simple answer would be, of course, that yes, it would be fought by the armed forces, but I would be incorrect if I were to restrict it to that, because one will have to harness national capability across domains in order to really make it happen. On 3 counts, this becomes vital. You did point out the various domains across which this becomes relevant. Yes, whether it is the entire dime matrix is covered in that. And for that, mere uniformed power is inadequate, which means it would have to be an all-of-government approach necessarily, whether in any which way you look at it. And the rate at which AI capability is morphing across the world would necessitate that in times of need, everybody who has any capability in this regard gets together to assist it. So obviously, while the law of armed conflict says something, unfortunately, all those agreements seem to be being put aside in various ways and means by different entities across the world as we see it. And so I don't really believe we need to be heavily bound upon those laws, because there is more breaking of those laws than the making of them.
Great. Now, before we move into the third piece, which is the specific recommendations I'm going to ask all of you to start making on the cross-institutional collaboration, etc., I want to invite a couple of people from the audience to maybe do very short but targeted interventions, basis what you've heard or otherwise. Air Marshal Sinha, if I may start with you.
Thank you. Lovely hearing everybody. Few things which coming out very clearly are that strategic autonomy is extremely important for our nation. And why I'm saying that, because last 1 year, the changes that are taking place across the world, we have to do things on our own. I'm very clear about that. Like Trump and Xi Jinping met in South Korea, and they discussed chips and magnets, and of course soybeans. 3 things. So we have to start making things on our own. It will take time, maybe 10 years or 15 years, whatever. If you look at the price of the GPUs, Blackwell costs about close to $40,000. Rubin, which is the latest GPU, is about $50,000. Can we afford that? And what if they stop giving it to us? So that is something to look at. People have spoken about it, but we need to make these things on our own. It'll take some time. That's one. Secondly, a bit about AI. We know this invention is going to make itself better, unlike fire or oil or electricity. AI will make itself better. It's very different from what we've seen in the past. You have to keep that in mind. And the book by Ray Kurzweil, he talks about singularity. We must have all read about that. That's the point when AI will start improving itself and you can't control it. So three thought processes on this. One is containment. That is Mustafa Suleiman. He talks about that. We know that. Second is alignment. Make AI work as per your requirement. And the third is what we all discuss out here is optimistic. Like Juan Jensen says, AI will be great for human beings. So if you look at these aspects also, where are we going with AI in our country? Can we control it? And what is the future of AI? That is something which I want to put across. And lastly is what Dharkar mentioned and everybody mentioned. What do we do with AI? How will we make it happen in our country? I think it's very simple as you look at it. Of course, difficult to do it. Big money, which the government is giving. The private players have to come in, big companies, and the creamy layer from IITs. I went to IIT Kanpur, I went to IIT Hyderabad. You talk to these people, they can do wonders. Of course, he's also there out here, he knows that. This combination of money and these people not going out, like Speedy mentioned, Dharkar mentioned about, thanks to Trump closing the doors, is the future for us. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you for that. Nitin, if I may bring you in also for a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Anirudh. I think I'll restrict myself to AI in national security. And one example here, one or two issues that I envisage is how do people working in civilians who want to work or are to be inducted into, giving AI use to defense services, how do they access data? That I think the security clearances are going to be an issue. Maybe the American model where they have inducted Palantir, Meta AI, and all those four tech company people as lieutenant colonels in their reserve unit should be the way forward. If Manan has to actually work on the AI model for defense, or you have to give them advice, or I have to work on, say, cognitive warfare strategies, do we get data at all from the armed forces given our strict regulations? I think that's something that to think about. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking about and talking at each other rather than looking at how to harness all of nation approach, not just all of government approach. What Marshal Dharkar said about all of government, I would try and tweak it to all of nation approach rather than all of government approach. Not just in the government, but in the civilian sector. How do you bring them into defense? Because your decision loop is going to be shorter and shorter as you go forward, thanks to AI as well as other technologies that has come in. And there, how do you stay ahead of the adversary is going to be the challenge. And I think there is some work happening on that as far as civilian induction into or civilian cooperation with the military is concerned. But I think some work needs to be done there.
No, great. So strategic autonomy, induction of talent in a way that works. Now, those were just meant as initial provocations, and for us to break the monotony of us talking and the audience listening. But I'm going to this time go around this side, and starting with Air Marshal Dharkar. Now, the third piece that I had mentioned that we want to try and cover is now a set of specific recommendations, specifically keeping two or three things in mind, what we've discussed. One, it seems private-public collaboration. Second, cross-institutional collaboration. Right? So the piece that we've discussed, academia, industry, startups, the government and the armed forces, what changes can be brought in, specific ones, so that you can have greater collaboration amongst these, more seamless and faster, I think, as all of you have highlighted. And if I may add and get your views, all three of yours, and this might be a little bit provocative, but let's do it, is who in India should be driving our AI strategy and implementation? Should it be centralized? Should it be decentralized? Each ministry, each domain on its own, more centralized? And whatever recommendation you have on that piece, maybe describe what that structure could look like.
Should I take first?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, so AI is interdisciplinary in nature, and therefore one AI rule cannot work. It's sector-specific guidelines and regulations. So recently, we have released AI guidelines for AI governance, and we have taken a stand that all instead of having a single AI act or anything, let us have sectoral regulators improving their existing regulation, tweaking it if required to fit in AI nuances, and secondly, helping coordination between them, so to have a whole of government approach, because you see we have IT Act, we have DPTP, we have Bharati Nyaya Sahita, and in all the acts there are provisions, legal provisions which can be applied to AI. Certain nuances may be required and those things are to be changed. And so is the case for sector regulation, because each sector with specific use cases have different requirements. So the guidelines and the change in existing regulation is the stand which we are taking. Because, we have to also remember that we cannot enhance the compliance burden on new entrants, and we have to expand the ecosystem as well.
But may I ask, ma'am, so let's say if I was to take the financial sector as an example, you have the SEBI as the regulator there. But really the expansion of the financial sector is not being driven necessarily by SEBI, right? So my question actually is, if we were to look at our objective as AI adoption, AI innovation, AI diffusion, clearly the regulator is playing a different role. My question was actually who can drive that adoption and innovation? Who in India, institutionally, should be driving that?
You see, we have India AI mission as an aggregator of all those areas. So one ministry is already there.
Correct.
But expanding it across the sectors, sector-specific guidelines should come, because again, one rule cannot fit in, depending on the perceived risk, the use cases, the size of deployment. And very importantly, we say AI innovation. Innovation could be as you have spoken. Innovation could be optimization of existing things, or it could be as deep as creating something new. So we have to enter into both areas, core research as well as optimization and inferencing and all those cycles. And therefore, it's important to encourage innovation in and ensuring the responsible AI also across AI life cycle. And therefore, putting a single rule or something is not going to help. And it is an iterative process. So we are waiting and seeing how things unfold.
Marshal Dharkar.
Yeah, while I would like to speak on behalf of all the three services in this regard. However, there are three parallels between AI and Air Force business that I would like to kind of highlight here. It's about speed, reach, and flexibility. I believe all three apply as much to the use of air power as we've seen in history, as with how AI is doing business today. And if I were to take from that, then I would believe something like centralized control with decentralized execution is a model that would work very well, because otherwise it would take away from the flexibility that is possible. And at the same time, if you don't have centralized control, then it would take away from, or it would probably draw everybody in so many different directions that it won't work very well. So I think that's just given that there are these three important commonalities between these two aspects of future warfare. Since I'm looking at AI in the security domain as we speak about this, so I think that kind of a model is essential, and that kind of adds on to what Preeti just mentioned.
Manan, if I may bring you both on that question, maybe, but more importantly on that cross-institutional piece that I asked. Are you satisfied with where our cross-institutional linkages have come to over the last few years, having been part of the IDEX program, being part of a startup, being in academia? You're seeing industry, academia, armed forces, everyone from your vantage point. How satisfied are you with the progress of these cross-institutional linkages as far as AI is concerned? And what kind of changes might you recommend to improve that further?
Sure. So certainly, I mean, there have the way from where I've been looking at since last few years, there have been a lot of welcome schemes, welcome moves for bringing people together for AI, whether it is through IDEX or any other such mechanism, or even the India AI mission. Now, there is a peculiar aspect that one needs to appreciate with technologies like AI, and this gets amplified when you're going inter-institution, right? Which is the fact that AI at the end of the day is a probabilistic technology, right? Unlike most other legacy technologies which have been built or adopted, which are more deterministic, let alone AI, even if you talk about AI, cyber, or quantum, all these three are probabilistic technologies. So, now how do you trade with probabilistic technologies in an inter-institutional environment, right? The books, the procedures, the mechanisms that exist to assess any output or any deliverable that is prevalent out there is mostly for deterministic technologies, for deterministic outcomes. So perhaps it needs to be seen with that lens that with these new emerging technologies, if we have to benefit on their induction, if we have to, because in my opinion, the leverage will not come with who has the perfect AI, but who moves first with AI, who moves ahead with AI. It's more of a technology of scale. So scale with the right pace, with the right time, so that cannot be missed out. So for inter-institutional framework, where we need to work is to have more flexible assessment tools, more flexible assessment options to assess intrinsically a probabilistic technology, something which is not deterministic. That is one. Now, your second question, who should be driving it? Anyone who drives India in the nation of becoming an AI OEM and not an AI services economy is the one who should be driving it, because sector after sector, if we keep going the services route, it's not desired. So that is my short take on that.
No, great. With that, may I hand over to Indrajit to take over the rest of the conversation?